This is Dr. Young, and I'm going to go over your week 3 work. You will have, actually, I'm going to go over our faculty. For the purposes of this class, we don't really have a call necessarily. We just have, if there's less than 2 students, or I think it's 3 students, we don't do the call. But I'm going to go over the presentation. And really quick in this video, and then I'm going to go over week 3. Okay. I apologize. There it is. Okay. So this is pretty much the halfway point. We have 4 units. And since we don't have the presentation, if you're seeing this video, I'm just going over the video part. I'm not going to do the call. The course, we already talked about the overview in the first, but we'll just go ahead and have a refresher on that. We're talking about staffing. So far, we talked about things like job analysis, planning, strategic planning, HR planning, the selecting a staffing model, things like that. Now we're going to get into more recruiting and internal and external recruiting, and then selection. So we've covered basically, laws, regulations that involve the strategy, planning, job analysis. We have not talked about measurement, external and internal recruitment, decision making, and selection, and that is where we're going to talk about in units 3 and 4. So specifically, we're going to get into different types of, this is of course objectives. I'm going to go ahead because we talked about, these are the overall objectives. So we've talked about the first 3. Now we're going to get into the last 3. So we're going to get into, different methods of recruiting, external and internal. Measurement, types of measurements. When we talk about our methods, we're going to, let's say we're recruiting for a customer service representative. We're going to talk about, okay, how do we reach the people that we want to apply for this job? Once we do that, we're going to talk about how we're going to measure them. Once we start interviewing, the application process, interviewing, bringing in people to interview, and giving any kind of selection tests or assessment methods. And then we'll go into selecting the final candidate, and then what happens after that. And this is a broad overview. Obviously, I'm not going to go into detail here, but I just want to give you an idea of what to expect the next 2 weeks. So, what you might be asking yourself, what does this class have to do with, what's the practical knowledge here? What's the real life example? Well, you're looking at the process from basically, this class is the process of, I have a job that needs to be filled, to having a person hired and placed in the job and keeping them in that job. I mean, that's basically that's the most fundamental, it's the most basic explanation that I can give. So obviously this is the whole process, and you might be involved in different parts of that process. You may not even be in HR yet, but you've probably witnessed or have some kind of connection to some part of the process at some point in your career. So what this class pretty much does is tell you, how does someone get, from an HR perspective, get placed in a job. So hopefully, and you may or may not be going into HR, but, this is obviously something that's very critical in business. And sometimes you might just somehow be involved in the hiring process. For example, me. I was in training and development so I was involved in this process from having a training background. I trained new hires, obviously. So I was, after they were hired, their orientation process, I was involved in. I was also part of an interview panel because a lot of companies, when they hire someone, they'll have peers, colleagues that, the person being hired is going to be hired on their team, so they'll have other team members come and sit on an interview panel. So just a quick note on how it relates to practical real life. You may not realize it, but if you think through, you might actually be part of this process at some point. Not maybe someone that's a recruiter per se, but maybe someone that's involved in the hiring process indirectly. That's something you might want to think about. So your second half, obviously we have discussion questions for units 3 and 4, and it's measurement and retention for units 3 and 4. For unit 3, the project's going to focus on internal recruitment and external recruitment, and unit 4 will consist of a comprehensive final exam. So you want to be making sure that you're doing your readings because that's going to help you with your final exam. And then here's some important terminology for the last units. And this presentation is in the course if you want to review it again. But we're going to talk about these things here like internal recruitment, selection testing, validity and reliability, which gets into measurement, scoring and utility analysis, orientation, outsourcing, and downsizing. Evaluation of staffing plans and retention. So these are all terminology. This is all terminology that you're going to want to know and read about. These get very detailed in the text, so please make sure you're reading your chapters, especially in light of the final exam. And the most important aspects of the last 2 units, just make sure that you're reading your text, reviewing the methods of external, internal, and internal selection, because there's many, especially external selection. Obviously, there's going to be more steps involved with that than internal, just because, you've already got someone in-house, so you have, more information on someone that's already working there, even if it's a position where it would be a promotion or a move to another department. There's going to be more involved with external versus internal most of the time. For measurement, make sure you're reviewing scoring methods and just all the methods listed to narrow down candidates to a single one, because sometimes you might have more than one phase of that. Just make sure that you're reviewing that whole chapter. Another thing is employee orientation, socialization, pay rate strategies, and that's something that's make sure to read that as far as how pay rate is assigned in your text. And staff plan, oversight, and evaluation. At the end of the process, every now and then a company should, well, I shouldn't say every now and then because some have a continuous review. But there needs to be a continuous or a fairly frequent review of evaluation, of staffing processes. So they need to make sure that the staffing processes are working correctly. So how do you do that, you might ask? Well, you're going to look at, like, if you're an HR director or whatever, and you're reviewing your turnover, and you notice your turnover is really high. Well, why is it high? Maybe you need to go back to your staffing plan and make sure everything's in place there. Are there no issues or problems that are causing high turnover? For example, maybe your measurement process isn't really good for the specific job that seems to have high turnover. So you would want to maybe zone in on that and evaluate that carefully. That's just one small example, but there needs to be continuous evaluation of statistics as far as turnover or low productivity in certain, job positions that might present some type of pattern that's out of the ordinary. You might want to look at that. And then retention. So let's say you've got a good staffing plan in place, but you keep losing employees anyway. Well, maybe your retention strategies are not effective. Maybe competitors are taking people from your organization because you don't offer enough to retain them. So that's another thing you might want to look at. So if you have any questions or concerns, let me know, and I'll be happy to assist you. This presentation is in the course. If you can't access it, let me know.